I always enjoyed listening to her. 2 hours with her teaching is worth about 2 months of listening to a lesser IP professor. It's probably worth about a year of surfing the internet with the kind of information she put together on her PPT. So I'm going to finish up today's lecture with how to do quality patents, which follows up on Professor Wang's focus on quality patents, and it also follows up on Dr. Julie Chung's advice to us to focus on doing a good quality patent application early on so that you don't have to spend 10 times as much on litigation or 100 times as much on buying patents later on to cover yourself when you're being sued by Apple or Samsung or whoever you're competing with. Just a quick little bit about myself. I'm a U.S. patent attorney. I help companies in China protect their inventions in the United States. Prior to that, I did 10 years of litigation. I defended American Airlines on the 9/11 attacks. After the 9/11 attacks, there were a couple of thousand lawsuits filed against the airlines and security companies and so forth. And prior to that, I did, prior to prosecuting patents, which I do now, I was prosecuting people. I was an assistant DA in New York, and I used to arrest people and do trials. Before then, I flew airplanes, and I was in the military, and I was an electrical engineer. So all of that combined to make me a patent professional. And I'm going to talk about the 10 common mistakes to avoid in obtaining strong U.S. patents. This stems from my experience at this law firm, Hauptman Ham, and in my prior law firm, where I've seen many people file patents and they compromise themselves and get weak patents. And I understand many people do just want a certificate, don't really care about how serious their patents are, but for the clients, for serious clients who have serious inventions, this is a good presentation because it focuses on how to get a strong patent. And let's start off the top 10. Failure to identify inventors. That's a significant thing because many times inventors, when they file patents, they don't realize how important it is to name all the inventors. Many times there might be 10 different inventors on something, or 20 different inventors on a semiconductor chip, or 2 inventors, whatever the case may be. But you need to get all your inventors in. So take an inventory of your invention when you speak to your client, and make sure you get all the people who are involved in the idea, all the people who conceived of the idea, not necessarily the people who worked on it later on and finished it off, but the people who conceived of the idea. And sometimes people think that's not a big deal because we all work in the same company, we're all cooperating, and everyone's on the same team. And yes, that may be true, for the first few months or years, but people move on and people have changes of mind about things, and employees can turn on their company. So then it turns ugly, and you have lawsuits, and then that patent that you successfully got for the law firm, for the client, gets invalidated because it did not have the proper inventors listed on the application. And even before you get a patent, it can be dismissed because you didn't have the proper inventors. The second thing to look into is be careful about is the failure to comply with duty of disclosure. Other countries may not be like this, but in the United States, they place a big premium on being candid, being frank, being telling everything there is to tell about your invention before you get a patent. And part of the duty of disclosure is to tell the U.S. Patent Office about prior art that may negatively affect your patent. So it's important to disclose known prior art. On the other side of that coin, of course, is if you honestly don't know what is the prior art, then you have no duty of disclosure. So I know some people, when they draft a patent application, they consciously will not bother, looking for prior art, because then they can honestly say they didn't know what the prior art was. But the good advice is always to do a search of the prior art so that you don't waste your time prosecuting a patent that someone's already invented, and disclose all of the known prior art. And the third item is disparaging prior art, which leads to problems during prosecution. I'm going to run through each of these individually. I'm just highlighting the first three, and the fourth one is inventor's disclosure. I'm going to cover harmful, limited words that you use in your patent application. In the United States, there are certain words that you shouldn't use. For example, don't use very limiting words. Like, for example, don't use my invention. It's essential that the antenna on my iPhone be 2 inches or 1 inch or whatever. It's better to say, it's preferable, never say something essential or something is critical, because then that can come back and bite you, because later on during patent prosecution, if you have to modify if you have to amend your claims, say you had a 2 inch antenna and you got to amend it down to a 1 inch antenna or 2.5 inch antenna, you won't be able to do that if you had said in your specification that it's essential that it be a 2 inch antenna. So that's an example of limiting words. Do not limit yourself with drastic words like essential and critical. And also operational state, especially on electronic devices. I was an electrical engineer, so like, for example, when people invent an electronic device like a mobile phone, it's always described in the sense of transmitting to another cell tower or transmitting to near field communications to a card reader, Apple iPay or whatever. So it's always described in the sense of its relationship with something else. And in common English language, people tend to say, this is a phone transmitting on the 2 gigahertz frequency range. Everyone understands what you're saying. But the problem in the English language is that if you read that critically, that means my iPhone is transmitting as I speak at 2 gigahertz. So you write that in the claim. Later on, 5 years later, you want to sue Samsung because they have a phone transmitting at 2 gigahertz range. Well, you file the litigation, and then the judge will read these things, will nitpick every single word and every single grammatical layout of your sentence, and he'll say, well, your iPhone, you have a claim here that an iPhone is transmitting on a 2 gigahertz range. Well, when Best Buy or Walmart was selling this phone, or when Apple was selling this phone online, was it transmitting? No, it was not transmitting because it was turned off. Therefore, Apple does not infringe your claim because when they sold it to you, it wasn't transmitting, it was turned off. So Apple does not directly infringe. You can get around that, of course, by claiming indirect infringement, but it's a lot more work and other things involved. So the better thing to do is to have written that claim in a non-operational state. So instead of saying a cell phone transmitting on the 2 gigahertz range, let's say a cell phone transmittable on the 2 gigahertz range. Then it's a direct infringement when Apple sells that phone online. So that's an example of these very fine features of English language that non-English speakers are not aware of. Just like many people in the United States aren't aware of the fine language subtleties of Guangdonghua, Shanghainese. I will also cover poor translations. One of the best ways to deal with poor translations is simply to incorporate by reference your Chinese patent application. Festo effects. Festo is a case in the United States concerning making statements that later on come back to hurt your application. So the best analogy to that is when I was prosecuting criminals a long time ago after law school, we would give a warning to the person we're about to arrest. We tell them, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, an attorney will be provided to you. So you have the right to remain silent. That's the same thing with the Festo case, in that when you are prosecuting a patent application in the USPTO, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, you have to negotiate back and forth with the patent examiner. And oftentimes you make arguments, and he makes arguments, and you make arguments about how your device is different from the prior art. And during those negotiation sessions, which those responsive office actions that you write, you're making ever so slight minor admissions about how your device is different or how your device is similar to other things out there. And the problem with that is that you may say things which affect your claim of infringement later on when you have litigation, when you sue someone for infringing your device. So, for example, say you're prosecuting a claim about say the antenna on a cell phone, and during prosecution, you negotiate with the examiner down to the point where you admit that it's a half-inch antenna, and then later on you get your patent, and the claim is kind of narrow, but you get your patent, and someone else builds a cell phone with an antenna that's maybe 3/4 of an inch long, and you sue him, but you cannot get direct infringement because his claims do not match your allowed patent. However, you can try to infringe him based on doctrine of equivalence, and that's where Festo concerns. Doctrine of equivalence means that your competitor's device, although it does not directly infringe every claim in your patent, it's equivalent enough. It's such minor differences that it's equivalent enough that by case law, it is a direct infringement. Well, if you had been slimming down your claim during prosecution to get the patent in order to negotiate with the patent examiner, you've been losing out on these arguments, and you finally get down to this narrow patent. You will lose the argument on indirect infringement via doctrinal equivalence, because you had done this and the festo comes into effect. So what I'm saying is that you would try to avoid these harmful festo effects by several different ways. One is simply you don't want to ever. Ideally, you don't want to narrow your claim, but you want to argue your claim. And instead of accepting the examiner's argument that the prior art is just like what you have, or that the prior art is an obvious improvement over what you have is an obvious improvement over prior art, instead of simply accepting that, or instead of simply modifying your claim to differentiate yourself from that, you try to argue that no, it's not the same, and no, it's not obvious, and you give the reason. But in the absence of that, you would try other festo obviating effects, like maybe going for examiner interview, because interviews with examiners are very effective, because then things aren't written down. The problem with doing office actions, and this is one interesting aspect of our firm. Our firm is located about a 5-minute walk from the USPTO, so it's very easy for me and my colleagues to walk into the patent office and talk with the patent examiner. And when you interview the patent examiner, it's effectively off the record. Nothing is really recorded, so you don't have a festo effect, and you could truly explain the invention to them. And finally, underinvestment in patent prosecution. Well, that just goes to what Dr. Chung was saying yesterday, that basically an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like he said in the example, whatever, $1.3 million spent in patent prosecution versus whatever, 10 million, 30 million in litigation versus 300 million in buying standard essential patents, or just buying whatever patent you can get your hand on to fight the litigation. And I tell you, litigation is extremely expensive. When I do a patent application, the initial filing fee is about $1,000. And like Dr. Chung said, a typical patent will, through a life of patent prosecution, would be about $10,000, $20,000 to include drafting a patent. You compare that with doing litigation. More than half the cost of litigation is in discovery. When I was defending American Airlines back 10 years ago, American Airlines, they weren't paying us, the insurance company was paying us. American Airlines didn't care what happened in the case at that point after 9/11, because they had an insurance company pay for everything. The insurance company was paying us $1 million a month just to pay all our attorneys to run out discovery. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think I covered a lot of these things already, but who owes the duty of disclosure? I mean, many times when when people are drafting and filing, prosecuting a patent application, things come up, and for example, prior art comes up. Someone discovers that there's some other inventor out there that did something similar to us. Well, who has the duty to report that to the USPTO? The USPTO puts an affirmative duty on the patent applicant to apprise them of what's going on. So the people who owe that duty are the inventor, the attorney of record, whether they be U.S. or non-U.S. patent agents, patent attorneys. The only people who don't really fall into the duty are people who aren't substantively involved in the patent application, like typists, clerks, organizations. If a small company is like a CEO would have a duty, for example. A CEO of like General Motors would not, but a CEO of like a small firm. I worked at a startup company 5 years ago in Silicon Valley, and we were just 6 people, so we all knew what was going on from the CEO down to the general counsel. So we all had an affirmative duty to report what we knew. So the duty usually centers around unpatentability of your claims. And we apprise the PTO about disclosures via IDS, information disclosure statement. I think some of this stuff is getting a little too detailed for our audience here, but this is more for people who file patents. Also, one good piece of advice in dealing with your client inventors, oftentimes inventors may not be familiar with the patenting process, so you should be aware that when you talk with the inventors, you should realize that the things they tell you may not necessarily be known by everyone. I've talked to inventors where they may tell me A, B, C, and D, and they will tell me that A and B are leading edge, cutting edge things that we got to patent today, and that C and D is old stuff. Well, old stuff to a PhD in electrical engineering in Silicon Valley may be unknown stuff to everything outside of his company. So be aware of that, because the inventors don't know what they don't know, and what would happen if you file a patent with only A and B and not putting C and D is that you end up not claiming what could have been claimed. The total technology package there. Also, if he tells you A, B is leading edge technology, but C and D is old stuff, and then you put in your patent application, you talk about background of the technology, and you start repeating what your inventor told you, and you say, yeah, C and D is prior, old technology, you would have given up free technology to the world. Because if you put it in your patent application, but you do not claim it, you've just given away all that technology, and you'll never be able to patent C and D. You'll never be able to claim it. So be aware of the technology and apprise your your inventor that everything that he or she thinks is prior art or common knowledge may not necessarily be so outside of the company. And I was talking about potentially harmful words on application. One of the newer words that we're finding that can be problematic in your patent application is funny, but it's actually calling your invention your invention. It's better to, if you look at old patents from 20 years ago, people called the invention, and it was fine. But lawyers being lawyers, especially in the United States, especially creative lawyers, over the years, laws become interpreted and reinterpreted, and it seems to be the state of the law now is that when you refer to your invention, you are limiting yourself. It's better to refer to your invention as an embodiment of my disclosure. An embodiment of my disclosure. Much better than saying my invention. And the reason is this: when you say this is my invention, you've limited yourself to exactly what's in that sentence that follows, this is my invention. Whereas if you say an embodiment of my disclosure is X, Y, Z, you did not limit yourself. That's just an embodiment. There could be 10, 20, 30 other embodiments. So that's what we're telling our client now. Do not refer to your invention as your invention. And like I said before, a lot of other words like essential and key and critical, those are problematic words to use. Here's an example of words and prosecution and what to be careful of. There's this case called Gentry Gallery versus Berkline Corporation in the United States. During prosecution, it's about a sofa couch. The invention was that they invented a sofa where you have a handle and you can recline the couch. Well, during prosecution, the claim said the handle has to be in the center of the couch. But during office actions, negotiations, and prosecution, the U.S. patent attorney successfully broadened the claim so that it didn't need to be in the center of the couch. The handle could be anywhere. However, in the specification is a part of the patent application before the claims, and the specification describes in more robust detail what the invention is. Well, in the specification it said that in the summary section of the specification, it says an object of the invention is that the console be positioned in the center of the couch. However, the claims did not say that. Like I said, the attorney successfully broadened the claim so that it didn't have to be in the center, it could be anywhere. Normally people think, well, the claim is the most important thing. And the claim says it doesn't have to be in the center, it could be anywhere. That's great. They got the patent. A few years later, someone invents a couch with a handle on the side of the couch, and it goes to litigation, and the guy who's being sued said, the specification here said that an object of your invention was to have the handle in the center of the couch. Mine's at the side. So he was hoping that would give him off the hook. Gentry Gallery says, look, I have a solid claim. It could be anywhere. You infringe. Well, the court sided with the infringer. The court told Gentry Gallery, look, your specification, in the summary, said an object of your invention is to have the handle in the center console. Therefore, your claim, even though it's broad, your claim is not supported. It's not enabled by your specification. Therefore, your claim is invalid. And he lost out. So that's an example of your specification and claims. They have to be supporting each other. And just be careful about what you write. Don't limit yourself. So here's the Festo effects thinking, which I talked about before. It just talks about how to avoid this negative effect where during patent prosecution you're limiting yourself. So we covered that. Probably the final advice, when you do practice, if you practice in the United States, getting good quality patents is you have to be careful with just getting the application down to as broad a claim as possible, yet not giving up too much during patent prosecution, and one of the best ways is to interview the examiner and to avoid unwanted amendments. And this admonition by Judge Rader, he is the former Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is the highest court in the United States for patent cases outside of the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is interesting coming from a judge. Usually judges don't care about patent drafting and patent prosecution. They're all about litigation and verdicts. Well, he said here that companies should place a premium on forethought in patent drafting. And that, like I said, is in accord with what we've been hearing this week about quality patents and focusing on getting it right from the beginning, so that you won't have to spend 100 times as much later on in litigation and all sorts of other negotiations and negotiation. Is there any questions? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a great audience. And it's 5:28 p.m. in the afternoon, and I think we can adjourn.